Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. And welcome back to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. On Strictly Facts, we've often talked about the causes and impact of migration, be that migrations to the Caribbean, from one Caribbean island to another, or migrations of Caribbean people to the quote unquote world powers. That latter question gets further complicated when we consider the impact of migration for second, third, and even continuing generations and their identification and connection to the Caribbean. Today's episode is a historical continuation of our episode on the Panama Canal, in which we discuss what happens to these migrations of generational identifications and the result of multiple migrations of and around the Caribbean diaspora. Joining us today to share about his research in this area is Dr. Khemani Gibson. Dr. Gibson, thank you so much for joining us and being a guest on Strictly Facts. Why don't we begin our conversation a bit today with where you're from, what is the research you do, and what was the catalyst for this research and your interest in history?
First, thank you so much, Alexandria, for welcoming me to this podcast. I'm so excited to be here. My research, it's actually a very interesting story. And I think for a lot of Black historians, our research is connected to our own personal lives. So I think Dr. Cornelli mentioned how she was connected to her research and like where her research kind of grew out of her own personal experience. Mine started with family history, actually. So my great-grandfather, ever since I was a child, I was told my great-grandfather worked on the Panama Canal and died working on the Panama Canal. And it wasn't until I was in college and I was doing a history project where I found an arbitrary document talking about Jamaican migrants going to Panama that I was inspired to kind of pick up and start learning like why were Jamaicans going to Panama. So just to kind of like backtrack a little bit about me, I'm born in Jamaica, but raised in New Jersey in the US my entire life. So there has always been like a desire for me on like just like any other first gen like immigrant to kind of like connect with my home and my heritage. And so kind of seeing that document in the archives as a college sophomore, I was like, oh wow, this is so interesting. Like I've been hearing stories about this since I was a child. And it kind of set me on this path to kind of uncover like why would my great grandfather go to Panama? And what was his life like there? And what caused him to die and like all these different things. And so I even did my senior thesis in college about it. And it continued, and I did my whole dissertation about looking at the West Indian immigrant community in Panama and moving on beyond migration, like how they are wrestling and grappling with issues of identity and community formation, and specifically like what does citizenship mean in this immigrant community that's in Panama? And like what does it mean for the Caribbean at large?
Definitely. I totally echo my own interest in deciding to get my PhD as we're working through it is definitely predicated based on my own family experiences as well. So thank you for sharing that. So jumping into our discussion today, as you mentioned, we had that amazing earlier conversation with Dr. Cornaldi, and I think she really broke down this history of West Indian migration to Panama, the building of the canal, and their experience as Black, often English-speaking people, and as the first sort of immediate immigrants to Panama. There were obviously some people who did go back to Jamaica or et cetera, but oftentimes people did stay. And so, as you were talking, even alluding to sort of your own family experiences, could you walk us through what happens later in that sort of aftermath? What happened to their Panamanian-born children?
Yeah, so it's this really interesting thing. Even thinking about when I started the research, I was really interested in the Panama Canal construction period. And then I think it was my first year of my PhD, I learned about what was alluded to in the prior episode about this constitution that's passed in 1941, which revokes citizenship to those that are born in Panama of West Indian parentage. And it was just something that was so interesting. I was like, wait, how is that possible? Like, where's this coming from? Like, how are they kind of barred from citizenship? And at the moment, prior to everything that happened in 2016 with the election in the US, the only thing that I could really compare it to were the issues that were going on in the Dominican Republic and Haiti in 2013. and with people of Haitian descent, like losing citizenship in the Dominican Republic. So it was something that was like, as someone that studied abroad in the Dominican Republic, it was something that was very interesting to me. And I was like, oh, wow, here's another example. And I want to kind of explore this a little bit more. And to kind of get to your questions, like what happens is that following the construction of the Panama Canal and its completion in 1914, you have this large immigrant population who has kind of many ways like made their home in Panama, but also still remain like maintain their ties and their connections to the Jamaica, to Barbados, to Trinidad, to St. Martin, to St. Lucia, all these different places across the Caribbean in general. So you have this network of people going back and forth. So for instance, in my research, you would have like people that maintain like boarding houses in Panama, but who would quickly go back to Jamaica and visit family or things of that nature. You would have those that were kind of more sedentary or like that stayed in Panama, and you would have those that would kind of like work or live in Jamaica and come back to Panama for like to work a little bit. You have this very robust community of people moving back and forth across the space between the islands and Panama. And one thing that my work talks about is how, following the construction of the Panama Canal, you have this transition of West Indian laborers going from being seen as mainly laborers in the Panama area to something more, right? What happens when a laborer is no longer needed to build this canal? Like, yes, we have this major drop off of people that are working on the Panama Canal because there's no longer a construction project, and they find work elsewhere, as Dr. Cornaldi mentioned, like they go to work on various banana plantations and elsewhere in the Caribbean basin. But you also have like those that are staying and they're making lives, and you have like the creation of like these papers, like the Workman and the Panama Tribune, that are like integral to the community and kind of like really kind of play a role in keeping the community connected to what's going on back on the islands. And I think that's kind of like what is really kind of starting to happen. You start to see like this immigrant community, while I wouldn't say assimilate is the right word, because there's like a lot of tension around that from the Panamanians about like they're not assimilating. But you do see them kind of etch out their own kind of enclave within Panama. And one thing that is really important to think of in a diasporic sense is how Panama's kind of like a case study of what West Indian immigrants are doing elsewhere in the region. So you see this happen in Cuba, you see this happen in Honduras, you see this happen in Guatemala. And it's kind of something that really kind of put this in conversation, because you also see that they're aware of each other's enclaves, right? So they're aware of people in Nicaragua who, like, they might be a cousin who went to work in Nicaragua and they're living in this community. So these communities, these enclaves are very interconnected as well.
Thank you for that. And I think, even pushing beyond that, I have definitely been interested in looking at what generations following migrations look like. So, could you talk a bit about how maybe these second generations of West Indian descended but born in Panama come to identify, they're Panamanian born, obviously, but what does that look like for them? And maybe what were sort of the generational differences in their experiences between them and their West Indian born elders?
Yeah, this question is similar to a question that I got during my proposal defense for my dissertation, where one of my committee members asked me, are they still West Indian following like a few years, or are they something else? And it was something that I was stumped at the moment. I was like, are they? And like it actually kind of forced me to dig a little deeper, because what is like a first gen immigrant or a second gen immigrant when they are no longer like raised in this like kind of ancestral home? And I would say that they are kind of caught in like this limbo, in this kind of like in between space, because they are very connected to Panama. They're going to Panamanian schools, and we can get into a little discussion about like some of the ways following the 1941 Constitution, how the second generation and onward try to prove their Panamanianness. But they are also very connected to the West Indies and the British Caribbean. So they're very connected to Jamaica. They're very connected to Barbados. One of the people that I've spent extensive time with his collection, George Westerman, who was a writer and then editor for the Panama Tribune and later an ambassador for Panama at the UN. He had Barbadian parents, but was very committed to Panama at the same time. So he was very committed to being Panamanian in the later 1940s and 1950s. But he also was like one of the distinguished guests that went to the Barbados and Jamaican Independence Days, when they actually received independence from Great Britain. So I say that to say that there are people that there of his generation that are kind of like in between in sense that they are connected to Panama. Like he literally goes on to represent Panama's interests in the UN, but they are also very, very connected and committed to this larger pan-Caribbean identity, this West Indian identity, and even like a Afro-diasporic identity, I would argue. And even getting to this earlier point I was making, so when the 1941 Constitution was passed, they kind of revised it in the late 1940s. And one of the things that they said that these Panamanian children needed to do to prove that they were Panamanian was to kind of prove that they were spiritually and culturally incorporated into Panama. So you would have some of this second and third generation writing to the officials saying that, oh, I revoke my like ties to the West Indies. I've never visited there. I've gone to Panamanian schools. I've been raised in Panama my whole life. And it was just such an interesting thing. But then at the same time, they are also a part of this extensive community that is very kind of like West Indian and also British West Indian, which I think is a very important component to kind of keep in mind.
There are two things that I thought of as you were talking. First, primarily in this issue of like renouncing who we are, the impact of colonialism, of the issues of nationhood and nation state and citizenship are definitely coming out to me as you're talking, but also is how this is further complicated with the British Caribbean, the ties to Britain, and how that sort of even eerily sounds like issues with Windrush, right?
Yes.
How this is sort of proving of your Britishness, but we won't get sidetracked in that. Also reminded me of this book by Mary C. Waters. It's called Black Identities, West Indian Immigrant Dreams and American Realities. As the title alludes to, it investigates West Indian experiences and how they change and evolve generationally. And I think Dr. Corinaldi got into this a bit, especially through ties of the US with Panama through these migrations. But I think also, as you're talking about, or you started talking about rather, it's also important to clarify what these migrations looked like to Britain. So what exactly were the experiences of this sort of West Indian Panamanian community to Britain? How are they similar or how do they differ from those who possibly migrated to the US?
Yeah. West Indian immigrants had a varied experience with dealing with British officials in Panama and even in Jamaica. So, depending on who the consul general was, you either had someone that was sympathetic or apathetic. You would have West Indian immigrants in unions going to the consul general saying, oh, we need your help to fight against the labor discrimination that the Americans are instituting, or like the pay discrimination that they have in the canal zone. And depending on the consul general from the British, they would be like, we don't care, or we're not going to really help because this union has like French West Indians in it, so we can't really assist you, despite the majority being from the British West Indies. Or you would have people who would decide, oh, yeah, these are our subjects, so we should kind of help and use them to our benefit, especially following World War II, where like there's this big push to rebuild Britain. There's like this kind of change in some of the consul generals saying like, oh, we can kind of use these West Indian immigrants and their Panamanian born children, like we can kind of like elevate them and kind of support them so they can kind of be sort of indebted to us and kind of come back and help rebuild Britain. And I say that because there's like this very big tension, regardless of who the consul general is, about protecting who has access to British citizenship. So I spent a considerable amount of time in my work parsing out like the difference between British subjecthood and British citizenship, and conclude that these West Indian immigrants aren't British citizens in the least, although they personally try to use their connection to the British Empire in whatever way they could possibly do to kind of advance their own personal goals and advocate for self-determination. The British were very convinced that they were not citizens, obviously, because they're Black and they're foreign and everything like that. But that's even more like magnified when you start talking about their Panamanian born children and their second and third generation. Like the British had these weird sexual politics of, oh, are these people actually born in wedlock, if not they're Panamanian? So when we have this constitution that's passed in 1941 and the Panamanians revoke the citizenship of these like second and third generation people of West Indian heritage, you actually have a conversation between the president at the time, Arnulfo Arias, and the British consul, whose name escapes me, but the consul general was saying like, "Oh, these people aren't British; they're Panamanian," and the president's like, "They're not Panamanian because this law's passed." And these second and third generation children or people, I should say, are kind of like stateless. So they were very invested in maintaining their like purity of British citizenship and who has access to it. And it would often force the community to kind of grapple with how to approach British issues or like approach your British officials. And sometimes it would be a mixed success. Towards, like I was saying earlier, by the late 1940s, when they're really interested in like rebuilding the UK after World War II, you have the consul general saying, "Oh, we need to give these Panamanian born people of West Indian descent like access to British subjecthood because they will be so proud to be British and they will like really help us." So it's like this very like it's very entangled. And I think that's the thing about my project that's always it like gives me a headache, but it also kind of really inspires me. It's like all these entanglements of like how you kind of parse through who like is considered a citizen, who is considered a subject, like how are my like West Indian immigrants and their children and their descendants defining themselves in this moment, and how are these officials from the British, the Americans, and Panamanians also trying to put them in boxes and like say like, oh no, you have access, but you don't have access, and how so quickly it changes.
I think through what you said, there's two approaches, right? There's obviously, as you mentioned, how these state officials are trying to dictate how people should identify, what they should be, which land body they should feel as quote unquote theirs, right? But then there's another opposite angle of that, and is in how they felt and how they identified. So could you talk a bit about this question of citizenship beyond maybe what the state has deemed for them, but how these generations of West Indian migrants and their descendants defined citizenship, and maybe even how this further continues into contemporary times when we think of generations later.
Yeah, so I'll start with like what my title of manuscript is, Citizens of Their Own Nation. And I literally conclude my dissertation, now my manuscript, by using that phrase because we can conclude based on like the two episodes, like the previous episode and now this one, that these West Indian immigrants and their descendants are not allowed access to Americanness. They're not allowed access to Panamanianness, and their access to Britishness and British subjecthood and citizenship is very tentative and conditional. So, in many ways, they are on their own. But we also see this very robust community that emerges in Panama. That like people are like any community, like they have their shops, they have their newspapers, they have their athletes, they have all these things that are part of a community, but yet still they're not like necessarily validated from these three main forces who are supposed to be able to subscribe like, oh, you actually matter, you have citizenship, you're a part of the state, you're part of the nation. So one thing that I'm working through as I kind of write through my manuscript is looking at how West Indian immigrants and the Panamanian more descendants understand that they are not a part of these entities fully, but they do understand that they're a part of this community that they really identify with. Where you can be of West Indian descent, right, going to a Panamanian school, connected to the British also, and positioning the British. This community is kind of like very kind of in flux, and it's kind of like hard to nail down. But like I think the people kind of understand that the nature of like where they live and like how they're inhabiting the space, but they understand that it's like all of them at the same time, more so. And one of the things that really kind of illuminates this is how you can find letters of people writing petitions to the British, for instance, during moments of crisis. So you would have someone that's like stuck in Jamaica who was taken to Jamaica from as a child and writing to the British to try to like say like, oh, I'm actually Panamanian, but I was brought here on a British passport and I need to get back to Panama. And it's just kind of like this really interesting thing where you have like they're all like West Indian and like Panamanian connected, but their identities aren't necessarily nailed down as easily as we would want.
Thank you for that so much. And very much so in line with these complications, these entanglements, and also even your own story. You mentioned your great grandfather having gone to Panama to build this canal. So, what have you experienced, or maybe what advice do you have for those who are looking towards clarifying this very complicated history in their own family's background?
So going back to the question in terms of that I got asked during my proposal defense, like who are they? And I will be honest, when the committee member asked that question, I kind of felt attacked because it's like, who are you? Kind of that's how I internalized it. Like I'm as someone that's kind of like fought to prove my Jamaicanness. I was talking about this with someone earlier. Despite being raised in the US and America, it was kind of like, wait, am I American because I'm just born here, despite like being very connected to Jamaican culture, even studying it, getting a PhD? Or am I no longer like, am I neither? So I think one thing, the first piece of advice I will give is like be okay with not fitting in into these kind of prescribed boxes of like nation and state and empire. And I think that's kind of like what my research and looking at immigrant community in Panama has shown me is like they're kind of there, like inhabiting these spaces. And it's yes, they're gonna have some people that are more heavily British identified, or those that are more heavily American, or those that are more Panamanian. But in general, there's not like a consensus about how to be. And yet still all of them exist in the same kind of community, the same kind of nation of their own making. And I think you continue to see this happen. You see this happen with Windrush. You see this happen with the immigrants coming from the West Indies, from Panama to New York and so forth, and those that are in Cuba and things of that nature. I think this kind of, you can't nail it down, this etherealness of being is one of the beautiful things about being human, and kind of one of the ways that I argue shows us the power of Afro-diasporic identities and their formation. It's not kind of like contained in this like easily defined box, because we have, because of trauma of slavery and colonialism and everything, have had to kind of recreate and like mold our identities to survive in various environments. And I think that's kind of really indicative of where we are, like for us to be here, me and you, to have this conversation, and even talking about how our work kind of stems from our own history, our own connections to our culture.
Beautifully said. Thank you for that. I think the existence of being both and, right?
Yes.
I don't have to be one or the other. It's possible for me to have been born here, but still claim allegiances to there, is always probably a deeper question I'll have to get into for another episode. I feel like I've gotten, based off my own family experiences, I feel like I've had people say different things to me throughout my entire life. But of course, I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I have to ask you my favorite question of all. What are some of your favorite examples of this, very intricate history in West Indian, Panamanian, diasporic, popular culture?
So this one was actually mentioned before, but Sadella Molly Booker has a rendition of Kolamanakam, which is like a great song that kind of talks about like the Jamaican specific migration to Panama. And it's like this really interesting part where even though he's dressed in like these vestments and like this really nice suit with a pocket watch, he doesn't use the pocket watch to tell time, but he uses the sun to still tell the time, which I always thought was like really interesting, because for Jamaicans, it's always about the show and presenting that you've kind of arrived. I'm sure you can kind of, you know what I'm talking about. So even at that moment where he just wants to show that he's kind of arrived and he got all this Panama money and he's like successful, but he's still using this kind of like very nature-based way of telling time versus like this more modern, and I'm putting modern in air quotes, way of using the pocket watch. The other song is not necessarily directly connected to Panama, and it's more so a poem, but it's from Miss Lou, called Colonizing in Reverse. And the reason I want to talk about this, because it talks about the Jamaican migration to London during the Windrush. And it's kind of really interesting to me to think about in my research, because of how the British were very kind of protective of who had access to Britishness, to British citizenship. And here we have this moment where now you have all these West Indian immigrants going to the UK to kind of help them rebuild after World War II. And it's kind of like really interesting to think of like, oh, like, of course, the British now, after all these hundreds of years, need these people that they've been oppressing and marginalizing to kind of help them rebuild the metropole. And in one sense, this song also talks about the opportunity that West Indian immigrants were always looking for to better their lives and to better their family lives. And in some ways, you can kind of use Windrush as kind of like probably like the third step in terms of migration and these outward migrations, because we have, like, in my opinion, the migration to Panama and to the rest of Central America and the Caribbean, the migration to New York from that. And now you have this bigger one. So you start seeing the diaspora from the Caribbean starting to get more intricate and complicated, and just a lot of questions around like identity and like where these people are fitting in. So this novel that I would actually do, that I also suggest, especially when talking about colonizing reverse, is Small Island by Andrew Levy. It talks about the plight of what happens when West Indian immigrants actually arrive in Britain and the racism and discrimination they face to try to achieve their dreams. And I feel like that complements the story in general.
Oyago. Stay tuned for Strictly Facts Sounds, where we connect our history to pop culture. Returning to our discussion on Panama, this Strictly Facts Sounds is all about films and documentaries. I have always loved the power of film to convey and bring stories to life, so I of course had to share these two with you all. The 2014 film Historias del Panamá, or Panama Canal Stories, was a major selection for both the Miami Film Festival and the Panama International Festival. It performs the experiences of canal laborers and their descendants, spanning from 1913, the year of the canal's completion, to 2013, its centennial, through a series of shorts by 5 very different characters. In addition, Panama Dreams is a 2018 docudrama by Bayesian and Trinidadian filmmaker Alison Saunders. In it, Saunders recovers the story of her ancestor, who, much like Dr. Gibson's story, left to help build the canal, providing a unique lens on Caribbean migration, diaspora, and the impact of migration on the West Indies. Check out both films on our syllabus at strictlyfactspod.com. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm always going to be a Miss Lou stan over here, so I love we've talked about colonization in reverse on Strictly Facts before, and it's a great piece. And Miss Lou is just so
iconic.
I'll have to, yes, definitely. But thank you so much, Dr. Gibson. I got to put the title on it because it's official. You know, please let everybody know where to find you and your amazing work on social media.
So I am on Twitter at Jamaican Scholar with an A, so Scholar A. Yeah, and I have a website, KhemaniGibson.com, that you can submit if you want to contact me.
Beautiful. And I will link all of that in our show notes, so you all feel free to contact Dr. Gibson if you'd like to learn more. As always, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, listeners, for being part of this conversation today. We hope you learned a lot, and we wish you a great week. Lickle more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.